Hello everybody, Pinstripe here and welcome to the battle plan. It's been a long time coming, but this is the first episode where we're going to be taking a look at the multiplayer map that everybody knows. It is of course Iceflow. Now many times in the past I've referred to this map as being the Hogs of War equivalent to Payload Upward in TF2, mainly because of how iconic it is within the community. In this series we're going to be taking a look at the strategies that this map seems to hold, alongside how each class within the multiplayer can be utilized while playing on this map. I'm going to start off by working my way around this map and discussing the key areas or placements that you should be looking out for. This does happen to be one of my favourite maps within multiplayer, so it's going to be pretty nice to finally dive into the mechanics and tactics that I tend to use when facing up against other players on this map. Now the first thing to note about Iceflow is that having the high ground doesn't necessarily warrant an advantage, as the large cluster of minefields can pose a big risk to gaining extra height over your opponent. Iceflow is, I believe, one of the only maps in the game to combine both poison water and regular water, which does pose other issues for wanting to remain on the high ground. The combination of water and minefields dominates this map as it stretches across pretty much half of it. If you take a look at the map from right to left, it moves from low to medium to high ground, with each area providing its own range of strengths and weaknesses. So let's start on the low ground. This area is considerably flat, although that's kind of obvious considering that 60% of it is actually water. Now here the major risks are the combination of both the explosive barrels and pickups, whereby you take the risk collecting the pickup and remaining in this area. Best advice really is to collect the pickup and immediately run away, as really you want to be keeping your enemies in this area at all times, preferably as close to the explosive barrels as possible for that extra damage. This is definitely a strong area for close range classes like Grenadiers and Engineers, as once again the combo of their explosive weapons can produce high amounts of damage alongside the explosive barrels. The other interesting part about this area of the map is the spawn points. Now, just as it is on the small island in the middle of the poison water, the game decides by default to spawn at least 3 pigs on these very small pieces of land. Ultimately, it puts the player who goes first at an automatic advantage, especially if it's a 4-player game. Next, we move on to the middle ground, which contains what I like to call the house. There isn't a specific name for this building, you can just call it whatever you want to, but it provides some interesting advantages and disadvantages depending on how you use it. It's a tricky one because if you stand and remain inside, you run the risk of taking heavy damage from projectiles that can be thrown inside the building. But then if you decide to stand on top of it, then yes, you do gain some extra height over your opponent, but you instantly become the center of attention considering that the house is slap bang in the center of the map. Standing in these areas around the house can give you some protection from incoming damage on the high ground. Just try and stay away from the explosive barrels though, as they do tend to have a decent explosive radius. I tend to avoid all of the areas in front of the house, as here you become very prone to taking damage and sliding down into the poison water. The outer edges of the middle ground pose the same problem, as you are either too close to the explosive barrel on one side and too close to the water's edge on the other. And then of course we have the high ground, which gives you a complete view of the entire map, but it's definitely a double-edged sword up here. It's perfect for your range-based classes like the Scout and the Gunner, but no matter where you stand, you always run the risk of being knocked into a minefield or down into the poison water below. From certain angles you can use the trees to block some incoming damage, but I wouldn't rely on them too much. You also have to take into account the spawn locations, as usually each player's pig are equally spread out across the entire map, so you should expect to find enemy pigs placed up on the high ground near your own position. Now each class in multiplayer has its own strengths and weaknesses, so let's take a look at how they tend to perform on Iceflow. The Gunner sits within the heavy weapons class, holding some high impact weapons such as the flamethrower, bazooka and the mortar. Because of their range, the Gunner is most effective when placed on the high ground. They are still quite lethal elsewhere on the map, but it really comes down to how accurate your aim is. The flamethrower is pretty effective at dispatching enemies at close range, and of course it combines well with knocking pigs into water and into minefields. It's worth noting that the gunner is one of the slowest classes in multiplayer, so don't go relying on this pig to run around the map and close down the gap between you and the enemy. The sapper is extremely powerful at mid to close range, as the use of TNT on this map usually results in either a high damage output or, death. Boasting the most amount of health out of all the classes in multiplayer, the sapper should be avoided entirely if you're standing near a minefield. Its weaknesses lie in its lack of range, as the shrapnel grenades can only be thrown a certain distance, and the grenade launcher requires a high level of accuracy from the player. The sapper shotgun is also the least accurate rifle in the game, as the spread of shotgun pellets widens the further the bullets travel, meaning that the sapper will need to be fairly close to their target in order to get the most out of this weapon. The high ground can be a strong area for the sapper, but only because of the combo with the minefields. Yes, you have a lot of health and you can sponge a lot of damage, but preferably you want to keep this class to the mid to low ground so you can patrol these areas for close range targets and capitalize on low health enemies. The Orderly is quite the runner. In fact, it's one of the fastest classes in multiplayer. Now, this class has some effective close range weapons such as the Rifle Burst and Tranquilizer, but you should really be looking to heal wherever possible. If you happen to be near an enemy pig, then by all means shoot him with a Tranquilizer, but if you spot that one of your pigs is on low health, it is your job to make the move and go and heal him. The Orderly is the only pig in multiplayer that can heal other pigs through their use of the infinite healing hands, so you need to make the most of them. One of the issues for the Orderly on Iceflow is the fact that there is a lack of health crates on this map, so if this class becomes poisoned, there isn't any other way you can remove the poison effect unless you happen to have another Orderly on your team. In competitive play, you are only allowed one Orderly on your team, so you really have to make your turn count. You have to make a split-second decision on whether to attack or defend, keeping in mind your own position and the position of the enemy pigs that may be around you. The Orderly is perhaps the most valuable class in multiplayer, so you're going to want to keep him away from the crazy firefights and environmental hazards as much as humanly possible. As the most nimble class in multiplayer, the Paratrooper can easily get from point A to point B. With 3 jetpacks, you don't necessarily have to worry too much about positioning. However, the Paratrooper does have the second lowest health out of all of the classes, so do keep that in mind, especially if you place yourself on the high ground. Because of their diverse range of weaponry, the Paratrooper can be used effectively pretty much anywhere on Iceflow, as the cattle prod and machine gun can provide a high level of knockback, while the infinite use bazooka gives the Paratrooper even more range. The Paratrooper can also use their jetpacks to knock enemy pigs around, which on Iceflow is perfect considering the large areas of water, particularly near the smaller islands. What the Grenadier lacks in range, it certainly makes up for in damage. Its cluster bombs and high explosive grenades can be used to great effect, not just through damage though, but also knockback. You don't necessarily want to place your Grenadier on the high ground though, as this class has the lowest amount of health out of all of the classes in multiplayer, and so can easily be killed by water or minefields if you nudge them in the right direction. My advice would be to keep the Grenadier around the middle ground of Iceflow. That way, just as it is with the Sapper, this class can play to its strengths and dominate that portion of the map. Don't forget you are able to bounce the Grenadier's grenades across water, so in that regard your range won't be as limited as it would be on other maps. Now I have to say, hands down, the Scout is extremely deadly when positioned on the high ground, buried amongst the trees on Iceflow. This is really where their ability to hide themselves from detection on the minimap comes into play, as there have been just countless times where I've played against someone and ended up forgetting that they still have a full health Scout just chilling on top of the cliff. Up here the Scout has a full view of everything, and if you're a competent sniper you have free range over the pigs below. So long as the Scout can play to its strengths and remain out of sight, it can be very effective on Iceflow. That's not to say you can't use the Scout anywhere besides the high ground on this map, as you can inflict some quick damage from pretty much anywhere on the map, Just remember that an out-of-place sniper is an easy target for sappers and grenadiers on Iceflow. So we've taken a look at all of the classes, but how would a single match on Iceflow play out? So the first thing you want to be looking for on Iceflow as you start the match is the spawn locations. We do have a favourable position here on the high ground, but as you'll notice, this island seems pretty cramped at the moment. We do have an orderly and a scout, our orderly and scout, next to the enemy gunner, which is not necessarily where you want to be, but we're going to be dealing some quick damage over here on to the paratrooper because he's the closest guy, and it's just some easy damage to start the match. Nothing too crazy, just want to keep the high ground, keep the damage going, and kind of knock him into the water if we possibly can. I like to go with the down angle because that's just how I tend to play. That's how I've gotten to use the bazooka, and as you can see, this isn't necessarily a favourable position for us. I am playing against the AI, so if this was a regular human being, they would probably take their gunner away from this area, usually either to over by the trees, bearing in mind that there is only 30 seconds on the clock, which is kind of the default in competitive play. So you kind of want to get away from this island as quickly as possible and then deal some splash damage with either a mortar or a bazooka to deal damage on both of my players. But rather than run away, he does use his flamethrower and does get some decent damage on my orderly, which is, as I said, one of the most valuable targets in multiplayer. But I'm going to move him away from this area, hopefully not taking any water damage on the way through. And then from here, I know that the gunner has just taken his turn, so you need to know the spawn turns. You need to know the turns of who is going to take their turn next. So I know that the paratrooper is going to be next up, so I immediately equip the tranquilizer and take my shot. So from that, we then are able to gain an extra turn, and that means that we can focus more on this side of the island, which will involve getting away from this area. But I do mistime my shot slightly. As you can see here, it doesn't quite go so well. I thought I had enough time. I'm aiming for this spot right here, just on the edge, to save as much time as possible. I've already wasted about 10 seconds or so just getting the jetpack and figuring out what I want to do, because you know, you need to be on your toes. You need to realize that you have to be in a good position, and I do not make a good play with my grenadier, because from here, as you'll see, I do not land where I want to, and yeah, it's kind of lame. You know, I'm not focusing on where I'm standing, which is close to the enemy grenadier, who's going to take the chance to deal some damage onto me. And you can see again on the mini-map, eventually as the round goes on, that more of my players end up on the far left side, and it gets a bit empty, leaving my grenadier exposed. But from here, as you'll see, this is really where TNT placement comes in handy, and you'll notice that the back wall over here is almost vertical, which kind of acts as a good way to use the TNT, which will normally be placed either here or, you know, just in this general area, and you want to be aiming for this back wall to try and push them as far back as possible so that they can bounce off the wall and, if necessary, back into the minefield. Sometimes it wouldn't have that amount of lift, but it's just a fail-safe to make sure that they slide back down into the minefield and you get the damage where necessary. So it is handy to know where to place the TNT and how that will react in terms of where that will knock back the enemies. But as you can see, he lands like directly in the middle of the minefield. I do take a little bit of damage, but I do get the kill on the orderly. As I said, the most dangerous class in multiplayer. I get lucky here because the AI is just dumb, and then from here, like I said, I'm looking at the double. You can see it right there. I'm aiming for a nice poison gas shot to go straight through, to skip across the water as well, poison 1, poison 2, and then see where we are from there. Because we are close to the enemy gunner, if you are playing against AI, if you're close to a gunner, they will just retaliate by shooting you with their pistol, which in the long run is way better than them using their heavy weapons against you and of course blasting you just anywhere. Literally any direction you will be taking some kind of water damage, unless you get lucky and land on the islands over here and not in the water. I know I said before that I wanted to, you know, get off this island, but so I am being a bit cheeky, but I do mess it up because that is just not enough power, and the shell just kind of falls down into the water. It doesn't have enough power to make it across the water and skip across. I do then take some damage, but we are back to our first spawn location of our gunner. So judging the distance is one thing, but also taking into account that terrain is vital when you're using your gunners, especially on Iceflow. I do overshoot this, and he does get knocked down into the low ground, but doesn't take any poison damage along the way, which is unfortunate. But then their paratrooper is just going to move about. And this is really where I'm thinking about, you know, where should I be going at this stage? How far along should I be moving my pigs depending on the position of my other classes? And also, just rolling it back for a second, that shot was pretty lucky because, you know, it manages to blast my sapper against the tree, so he doesn't fall down into the low ground getting poisoned. He doesn't get pushed across into the minefield. It just slap bang falls. He bounces off the tree, and we get incredibly lucky with that one. One thing I notice I do get quite bogged down in is being too attacking when I'm playing as an orderly. So you can see here I have two targets across from me. I can either go for the gunner, who is currently being taken care of by my scout, or I can go for the paratrooper, who isn't necessarily being targeted right at this moment. I do that, but what I should really be doing is retreating and going for my grenadier, who is slowly losing health, slowly depleting. I am of course playing with competitive rules, which would mean that I could only use the healing hands once, but in hindsight, you know, that's really what I should have done rather than do what I'm about to do now. You can see that I am focusing on positioning a little bit, you know, taking into account the explosive barrel behind me. So I do get up in his face, which means that I am, you know, full on attacking. And I am also taking into account his health, which at this point is on 54, which means that on my next turn, which I do this by the way, I could use a rifle burst, get his health down, and then it's all just a game of numbers. But like I said, again, should have been retreating, doing some healing, and then focusing on some attacking if I could spare the time. Again, the Grenadier is going to come in, and yeah, my position isn't great, and he does an interesting play here where he plays it to the back. The explosion occurs, knocking me towards the poison water, even though I am already on low health, so the most I can do is skip this across, deal as much damage as possible, gets him down to 15 health, and from there, it's not going to play out too well for my Grenadier. As always though, I have forgotten about the scout that is currently chilling by a house, and he is going to take down my Grenadier with a simple shot from the grenade launcher. Something I was hoping wouldn't happen, but from here, you know, my attention for my sapper goes onto their enemy scout because I need to move him from that position. You can see if we just give it a little freeze frame, I could go for the Grenadier, but he is on low health. If I had a mine, that would be perfect. If this was a single player class, that would be lovely, but my attention is on the scout. He's not too threatening, but I don't want him to get too cozy over in house. Knowing that he has 53 health, it is completely up to me to try and blast him in any one of multiple directions. Basically, I want to be sending him towards the water and trying to just push him in, because if he falls in, he is a goner, given that he'll only have like 3 health left. And thankfully, I do get incredibly lucky with this shot, positioning it just enough to push him into the water. Notice as well that I position my sapper close to house to give me cover from the enemy gunner, just in case he decides to turn around and try and shoot me. But again, like I said, pistols coming out, no real crazy damage, nothing to worry about necessarily. And this is where you want to retreat. Now that you have things, you know, it kind of where you want them to be. The enemy gunner is poisoned. There's a rocket launcher right here. You want to grab that and then immediately retreat to a safer area, staying away from the explosive barrels, just staying away from these entire islands basically, and getting a better position. So just like that, we're going to take the rocket launcher, position ourselves, you know, with house kind of in the way, and you know, from this spot right here, this could go any kind of way. Sometimes if you're able to hit the pig, you know, dead center, then it can normally push him, you know, straight ahead. But sometimes if you go maybe a little bit by his feet, left or right side, it can push him in any direction that is possible. Sometimes you can even blast them this way, you know, it's anyone's game sometimes. But luckily for me, I managed to hit him like dead center, and it does make contact, and look where he falls. He's right next to the explosive barrel, which means that unless he moves, he is going to be a goner. So the paratrooper misses a turn. Again, I still have the high ground. There's no point moving my gunner from this position because this is where he's at his strongest. And of course, if we just move it a little bit further along, if the if the bar at the top would get out of the way, you can see here I have a dead straight shot to their enemy grenadier, and I do actually overhit it slightly. I do tend to go for the low angle shots, like I said, but sometimes you just overshoot it, but it doesn't matter. He's on low health, so you don't always have to be super accurate with your shots. As long as you get the damage in that is necessary to take him down, or, you know, not have enough health if he's poisoned, that kind of thing, then yeah, no worries. It's quite surprising that the enemy gunner went for my orderly, but it's not going to bother me too much. I know that my scout has it covered, so I can just pull out the rifle burst, get his health down to 8, and not worry too much about his close range weapons. It's only 20 damage. If you know you have the health and you have the ammunition and the firepower to, you know, stick around for a few turns, then by all means. And here I get the high ground on the house because essentially I know that I've won, and I could do one or two things here. I can either circle round and go for the paratrooper, which again, if I had a mine, that would be perfect, but it's just too juicy. Look at this. He's just right next. He's right next to the explosive barrel, which means that I'm just going to pull out a shrapnel grenade, angle it down, and get double damage on both him and the explosive barrel, dealing like 72 damage, something like that, something mental like that. But you can kind of tell that the game is pretty much in my favor. It's pretty much over. I did intend to finish this match with all my pigs intact, but it was not to be, unfortunately, so I'm going to finish it off with a knife attack, and that is going to be a win for me right here on Iceflow. And yeah, good times. Now, if you haven't noticed already, the key pieces of equipment that you'll find on this map are rocket launchers, jetpacks, and you'll also find some TNT over on the high ground. So this has been my complete battle plan for the map known as Iceflow that you find in multiplayer. If you guys have any questions relating to the content mentioned in today's video, then do let me know in the comments alongside any thoughts that you may have about Iceflow. As always, let's get a discussion going in the comments about the map known as Iceflow. What tactics do you guys tend to use when playing on this map? Do let me know, and I promise that it won't take me another 6 months to make the next episode of the battle plan. But in the meantime, I will catch you all later for the next one. Peace out, everybody.
Destination